Un aplauso tradicional. Episodio 55 de Gym Rats. ¿Y qué les puedo decir antes de cualquier otra cosa? Tenemos un invitadazo internacional el día de hoy, de puro lujazo, estamos de manteles largos. Tenemos al Dr. Creatine en persona, así es, Scott Forbes, desde la Universidad Brandon en Canadá. Y pues sí, efectivamente el día de hoy vamos a estar hablando de creatina, acerca de pues qué es este suplemento, por qué es interesante, tanto para un gym rat como para la población en general. Y también, desde luego, antes de darle caña al asunto y agradeciendo el tiempo y espacio que nos ha otorgado el Dr. Forbes, recordarles que si gustan apoyarnos y que nos permitan seguir con esto del podcast y seguir adelante tratando de darles la mejor información posible, no olviden darle un vistazo a nuestros patrocinadores de Essentials para cubrir todas sus necesidades de suplementos. No olviden, siempre y cuando el espacio nos lo permita, porque tratamos de ofrecer calidad, pueden buscarnos, tanto Ángel como a Fer como a mí, para asesorías. Por ahí vamos a estar con Fer dando un curso que ya a estas alturas, ya cuando se publique este episodio, ya está en curso acerca de nutrición para el fitness en Universidad CDFIS. Y pues sin más, ¿qué les puedo decir? Thanks again for your time, Dr. Forbes. It's really a privilege. It's an honor to have you here. And first and foremost, can you give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah, very happy to be here. I'm an associate professor at Brandon University in Canada. I'm also a certified sport nutritionist through the International Society of Sport Nutrition. And I've actually also completed the International Olympic Committee diploma in sport nutrition as well. And then I'm also a clinical exercise physiologist through our Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology. In the US, it's known as ACSM. So the Canadian kind of equivalent is known as CSEP. So through that organization, I'm a clinical exercise physiologist.
Man, that's pretty cool. And most importantly, future 2024 Olympia contender, am I right? Or is it 25?
Yeah, 2025. So I need about 2 more years to put on a little bit of body mass, and then yeah, watch out.
We'll be competing together, man. Básicamente, compañeros Gym Rats, pues, ¿qué les puedo decir acerca del Dr. Forbes? Mucha de la literatura que nosotros solemos citar respecto a la creatina, él es autor o parte de los autores principales, digamos que es un referente en todo lo que tenga que ver con investigación de la creatina, y él justamente realiza su investigación, como nos estaba comentando, en la Universidad Brandon, en Canadá, adicional de muchísimas otras certificaciones internacionales, una por el Comité Olímpico Internacional. Y pues bueno, Ángel, Fer, le cedo el micrófono.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Doctor, to you stay here in Gimrat podcast. And I have some topics, but the first one is why creatine? Why your love for this supplement molecule? Why creatine to all the science of sport, nutrition, to performance, to cognitive functions, all their population, all this topic. Why creatine?
Yeah, I love creatine because I love science, and I think there's a lot of science to support creatine for a lot of different reasons, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think it originally started to basically show that it's a benefit for younger individuals, younger adults, to take creatine to get bigger and stronger muscles. Now we know that it can be a benefit for older adults to get bigger and stronger muscles, but also to enhance function. And now we know that creatine can do a lot more in the body. So it can also impact your bones, can make your bones stronger. It can impact your heart. It can impact your brain. And so that's why I've been really passionate and interested in creatine, is because it can do so many things within the body.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a typical question, but we know that are multiple mechanisms that the creatine works. One is the hyperhydration in the muscle cell. Another one is increase the viability of ATP. and the glycogen storage, some multiple mechanism, but the creatine that is inside of the muscle, and when we consume in a supplement, we need to work out the muscle to see this function, or it's only by taking creatine like in older adults. I don't know if it's an other mechanism of these potential benefits in cognitive function, or is only the muscle cell.
Yeah, so to get the muscle benefits and the bone benefits, you have to combine creatine with exercise.
Yeah.
But for the cognitive function, it seems like you can just take creatine and you do not have to combine it with exercise to get the benefits. Although there are studies that have combined creatine with exercise and have shown that it can enhance cognitive function. So as you mentioned, there's multiple mechanisms of how creatine actually works. And one of them is simply providing the cells with more energy, but you need to use that energy. So you need to actually perform resistance training to get those benefits. So if Daniel just wants to take creatine and sit on the couch all day and hope that he's going to look more jacked, that's not going to work. He's going to unfortunately have to go to the gym and lift some weights, and he might be able to perform a couple more reps over multiple sets, and that can increase training volume and perhaps enhance muscle adaptations.
Man, I gotta be honest, that's quite a bummer because I was really already stuck on creatine and decided not to pay my gym membership and get more creatine. So maybe that wasn't the right move. Y un poco de contexto para los gym rats que nos están escuchando. Fer preguntaba por qué el interés del doctor Scott sobre la creatina, y pues es básicamente porque le encanta la ciencia y creo que se nota, si lo sigue en Instagram se darán cuenta. Y cómo la creatina, pues bueno, sí vemos ciertos mecanismos como es hiperhidratación de las células musculares, cosa que se suele malinterpretar como si fuera algo malo, pero es todo lo opuesto. Pero más allá de eso hay algunas funciones bastante interesantes como mayor retención de glucógeno, muy importante para gym rats. También cuestiones más allá del propio músculo, como la función de los huesos. Y algo también emergente, que es algo que nos gustaría andar un poquito más, acerca de la función cognitiva del cerebro, cómo consumir este suplemento puede tener un mayor beneficio.
Totalmente ahí, Dani, te voy a dejar que si puedes, por favor, traducir lo que voy a decir para el doctor Forbes. La verdad, no estoy muy seguro de mi inglés, entonces mejor tradúcelo para ver si puede llegar mejor la idea. Y mi intención era justamente lo que tocabas respecto a las áreas clínicas, sobre todo cognición, memoria y lo demás. Respecto a eso, desde su perspectiva, obviamente, que está más inmerso en estos temas, ya al final de cuentas existe una consolidación bastante fuerte de la creatina en el área del deporte, pero en el área clínica, desde su perspectiva y toda la profundidad que tiene, él, donde puede ver que puede ser una línea de investigación pues bastante prometedora respecto a eso, ¿no? Respecto a la evidencia que ya se tiene, donde se ve bastante promesa de este suplemento que como decimos, ¿no? Muchas veces utilizamos, tenemos el pensamiento primero de que nos va a ayudar a ganar más masa muscular, pero desde la perspectiva de él respecto a otros temas, ¿cómo está esa línea de investigación?
Muy buena pregunta, es justo lo que también quería ahondar un poquito más. Dr. Forbes, my man Angel right here is asking that the function of creatine itself on sports is really well established by various mechanisms, but more in the clinical area, where do you think, based on your experience in the research and also, well, maybe as a practitioner, where do you think the line could be in the future for creatine as a clinical supplement? Maybe brain health, maybe cognitive function. For you, where is the future, to put it that way, in regards to creatine and clinical research?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think that's where the research is headed. We know that it can make muscles bigger and stronger for younger individuals, but also for older adults, so it could prevent sarcopenia. And then we know that now it can also influence the brain. So I know we've done a pilot study in individuals that have had a stroke. And we have shown some benefits of taking creatine in that population. But I think creatine can have a positive effect on like Alzheimer's disease or dementia. But we need more research in that particular area. So I think it could have some clinical benefits in those populations. But I think that's where the research is going. And hopefully we can answer the question of if it actually works in those populations in the near future.
Yeah, and only it's a misconception that well, it's creatine, it's inside of the muscle cells, and when we took creatine outside of, it's creatinine in the bloodstream, and the misconception of can damage the kidneys, can damage all this stuff. But if we understand how works creatine, why don't damage a kidney in a person, or if it's a contraindication in these people.
Yeah, so in healthy people, there's no evidence that it does any damage to kidneys, particularly in the recommended doses. So there has been a few case studies reported in the literature. There was one case study where the individual self-reported taking over 200 grams of creatine per day. And this person was also taking multiple other supplements as well. And they had kidney dysfunction. So in the paper, they highlighted that, you know, they were taking creatine, but I'd like to point out that they were also taking multiple other supplements as well. And that dose was, you know, 10 times or 20 times higher than what's recommended. So I would say if you take creatine in the recommended dose, there is no evidence that it could actually do any damage to the kidneys. And then, as you mentioned, creatine is non-enzymatically degraded into creatinine. And creatinine has been used as an indicator of kidney dysfunction. But it's important to realize that if you take creatine, that your creatinine levels may be elevated, but that doesn't actually mean that your kidneys are having a problem. So I think that's important for doctors to realize that there's that confounding variable of taking creatine when you're trying to, you know, identify if somebody has kidney dysfunction or not.
And what do you think, or in your trencher, what do you see that is a poor practice of the use of creatine in dosage, in times, in the only excessive dose that the people or in sports science use? What do you see in the trenchers, that it's a bad idea or it's no beneficial?
I think you're asking if if it's going to be a safe supplement in those clinical populations.
Yes, like if there is any perhaps contraindication in some sort of clinical population for taking creatine, because like you mentioned, I was actually a victim of that. I remember when I was studying my degree in nutrition, I got diagnosed with acute kidney failure because creatinine, how do you say it in English? Creatinine was
yeah,
a little
creatinine,
that one.
Yeah,
that was a little high because, well, I was taking creatine. Obviously, I was having like I do now, a high protein diet, but also I trained the day before the blood samples, so that kind of got me in trouble for no for no real reason. But I think that's more so the question on itself that Fer is asking, like if there's any contraindication for creatine in some clinical population.
Yeah, and I would say there is no contraindication of creatine. So creatine is one of the safest supplements. Our bodies naturally produce creatine. So everyone has creatine within their bodies. Essentially, when you supplement with creatine, you're just filling your cells with a little bit more creatine and a little bit more energy. And that energy can be used for a variety of different things within the cell. It can enhance cognitive function. It can enhance muscle adaptations. So there's only a benefit of taking creatine.
Man, and that's quite the statement. I haven't heard that before for any other supplement, that there is no contraindication and there's only benefit. I think that needs to be remarked, man, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree. If you think about caffeine, for example, yeah, it can enhance, a variety of different things, but the downside is it can impair sleep. So that could be for sure a negative, and we know the importance of sleep for health and performance. Yeah, we know even protein, it's possible to consume too much protein. Very, very difficult to consume too much protein, but it is possible. Whereas creatine, I think it's very challenging to consume too much creatine. And yeah, there's really no side effects associated with creatine.
I can try right here, right now, man. I mean, I can open this up, get a creatine bath. Muchachos, Gym Rats, un punto importantísimo que acabamos de escuchar aquí con el doctor Scott Forbes es que a la fecha, basados en la literatura científica, no existe ninguna contraindicación para el consumo de creatina como suplemento, al menos no que sepamos a la fecha, y eso es algo bastante importante a notar porque no hay otro suplemento del cual podamos decir eso. Por ejemplo, la cafeína, lo que comenta el doctor Scott, es que, ok, sí hay algunas contraindicaciones, una de las más, pues, menos peligrosas, pero sí problemáticas, es que puede interferir con el sueño. De un suplemento proteico que quizás sí puede ser difícil consumir demasiado, pero sí puede existir contraindicación. Y no parece ser el caso para la creatina, que va en relación a lo que comentaba Fer, de alguna contraindicación en el contexto clínico. Lo cual, insisto, creo que es una de esas particularidades que tiene la creatina, que también pienso es por lo cual es tan popular y por lo cual seguimos hablando y hablando y hablando de la creatina. Y aún así, algo importante que también se me olvidaba comentar en español, es que todos estos beneficios van de la mano del ejercicio. Necesitamos entrenar sí o sí. Si pudiéramos quizás tener algún beneficio en lo clínico, puede ser, no estamos muy seguros, pero necesitamos para obtener los beneficios bien establecidos del monohidrato de creatina, entrenar. Necesitamos el componente de entrenamiento de fuerza. Ángel, Fer.
Also, we see some studies that in patients with vegans or vegetarian people that is deficient of creatine, in this population, how can creatine works of that deficient molecule in their body, in their brain, in all this stuff, and how it works in these people that not consume a lot of protein sources, etc.
Yeah, for sure. So we know that creatine is found in food sources such typically red meat, seafood such as salmon or herring. And so if you're not consuming animal based diet, then you're vegetarian or vegan. And we know that you have lower amounts of creatine within your muscle. And they tend to be more responsive to creatine supplementation. So there's kind of two things that determine your responsiveness to creatine. One is how much creatine you get in your diet and how much creatine you have in your muscle before you start to supplement. And so we know that vegetarians have lower amounts of creatine in their muscle, and they tend to be more responsive to creatine supplementation. The other factor that's important for responsiveness to creatine supplementation is your fiber type. So if you have more fast twitch fibers, you tend to respond better to creatine supplementation. But your question was asking about vegetarians versus omnivores. Yeah. So I explained at the muscle level, there's a difference, but actually there is a really nice study done. I'm looking at how much creatine was in the brain between omnivores and vegetarians. And they actually showed that they had the same amount of creatine within the brain. So just because you're on a vegetarian diet doesn't mean that you're going to have less creatine within your brain. So I found that really interesting because there's a really distinct effect at the muscle level, but at the brain level, there's not a clear difference between vegetarians and omnivores.
Okay. This is an amazing data that I don't see, because always the correlation is we poor creatine in muscle cells, more poor creatine in all the cells of our body, and all this stuff.
I didn't know that also. And I think kind of makes sense thinking about body priorities, right? Like, okay, let's see what's more important for overall health and well-being. Is it having a little bit more of creatine in your muscles or in your brain for decision making, perhaps, and a lot of other stuff? Maybe the later, right? So I didn't know that, and I agree. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and your brain has its ability to create its own creatine. So it doesn't rely on just exogenous production of creatine. Like the muscle level, your muscle cannot create creatine. It has to take creatine up from the bloodstream, but your brain could actually synthesize its own creatine. So your brain does a good job of kind of, yeah, as you mentioned, looking after itself and taking care of itself, which is probably one of the most important organs, obviously, for survival.
And also it's curious, this inter-individual response of the people that have a consumer for creatine, because what of this context of people are of what genetically inter-individual response, it's the correlation of a poor response with a better response of the consume of creatine.
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt right there. I just wanted to reinforce that question, because I remember a post by, I think it was Menno Henselmans, and he mentioned that for himself, creatine doesn't do much really, and he's not a vegan, he's not vegetarian. So I think it's interesting that even if we have the number one supplement, Dr. Scott, why do you think are these key differences between individuals? Why some people can benefit more or maybe others not so much?
Yeah, for sure. So at the muscle level, we know that there's those two factors that determine responsiveness to creatine. One is how much creatine you get in your diet, or how much creatine you have in your muscle before you start to supplement, and then also your fiber type as well. So if you have fast twitch fibers, you tend to be more responsive to creatine supplementation. But even people that consume a lot of meat, they'll still respond to creatine, but maybe to a lesser degree. And so I believe that most people, if not all people, will respond in some degree to creatine supplementation. But for sure, some people respond less than others. There's also potentially some genetic differences between responders and non-responders, but that data needs to be explored further. So there is some preliminary data from actually a Brazilian researcher, Marco Machado, that has looked at some genetic polymorphisms in relation to responsiveness to creatine. But it was on just a single study that I'm aware of in a relatively small sample size. So we need more data looking at that. So there's perhaps, different gene polymorphisms that can predict responsiveness as well. But at the brain level, we know that it's actually very challenging to get creatine into your brain. And some people don't respond at all to creatine supplementation. So they'll have no increase in brain creatine content following supplementation. So it is possible that some people don't respond to creatine.
In which time the doctor's code consume creatine?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And we know that if you take creatine close to your exercise, that can help with creatine uptake. I think that's important when you're loading your muscles with creatine. But we know that, for example, Daniel has been taking creatine for a very long period of time. And so his muscles are saturated with creatine. And for him, it probably doesn't matter when he actually takes creatine. And we also have looked at whether if you take creatine before training or after training. and we found no difference with regards to responsiveness to that creatine supplementation. So we actually did a within subject design. So this is where we had individuals train one side of their body one day and the other side of their body the next day. And one side of their body got creatine before training and the other side of their body got creatine after training. So the good thing about this design is it controls for fiber type distribution, your habitual dietary intake, you get the same sleep, all those things that, you know, potentially can influence muscle adaptations were controlled because you're the same person. Just once your body got creatine before training, the other side got creatine after. We found no difference with regards to gains in muscle size or muscle strength. So I suggest, again, if you're consuming it, if you're just starting out with the supplement, to consume it close to your training session. But whether you consume it before training or after training, and we also know that if you consume it during training, it also works as well. So really any time is the best time to take creatine.
Tocando
Algunos puntos clave,
Dale.
nada más para que no se nos vayan mezclando, algunos puntos clave han sido que el timing de consumo de la creatina no es algo tan importante. El doctor Scott hizo un estudio con un modelo dentro de sujetos, el within subject, así le llaman, y lo que eso supone es que un mismo sujeto realiza las dos condiciones. Por ejemplo, una extremidad hace cierto entrenamiento y la otra otro tipo de entrenamiento. Y lo que encontraron es que el timing de la creatina no hace mayor diferencia, incluso si la consumimos antes, durante o después. Eso por un lado. Por el otro, estábamos comentando acerca de la variabilidad en la respuesta al consumo de creatina, que sí hay ciertos componentes genéticos de los cuales no estamos muy seguros, se necesita más investigación, estamos más datos de por qué sí, efectivamente, independientemente de la dieta, si tenemos a alguien omnívoro o alguien vegano o vegetariano, algunas personas parecen responder mejor. ¿Por qué exactamente sucede esto? Necesitaríamos más investigación, al menos con lo que sabemos a la fecha, pero todos pudiéramos beneficiarnos en mayor o menor medida de la suplementación, ya sea a nivel muscular, a nivel óseo, incluso a nivel cognitivo.
Totalmente, y creo que ahí ya tocando un poco la minucia, mi pregunta es a base de la dosis, por ejemplo, de creatina respecto a eso, porque a la hora de que ya existen como diferentes objetivos, en este caso de tal vez donde se busque un beneficio en la cognición, en la memoria y por otro lado también el beneficio en el área deportiva, realmente en este punto existe una variabilidad muy grande de la dosis respecto a qué beneficio estemos buscando o se puede mantener por decirlo, un gold standard de 0,1 gramos sobre kilogramo, ¿no? En este caso.
I have a really good question for you, Dr. Scott. In regards to dosage, we do know that maybe 5 grams for overall muscle saturation of creatine levels, it's more than enough. But what happens with brain health? What happens with cognitive function? Is it the same dosage? Perhaps do we need more? What data do we have? What do we not know in regards to that particular benefit from creatine?
Yeah, for cognition or brain, we don't know what the best dose is. So we're actually just finished up a study where we had a placebo, 10 grams of creatine or 20 grams of creatine. Unfortunately, we actually found no improvements in cognitive function. So even with those, with the 20-gram dose or the 10-gram dose, but our hypothesis was that the higher dose would be better because it is challenging to get creatine into the brain. So we thought perhaps it would require a higher dose to get that benefit, but we actually, our data didn't support that. And maybe for older adults where creatine seems to be more effective to enhance cognitive function, we need to do a dose response study. But in young, healthy people at rest, whether we gave them 10 grams or 20 grams of creatine, it actually made no difference on cognitive function, which was kind of interesting to us. But that's the result. So we don't know what the best dosage is. As you mentioned, 5 grams seems to be effective and sufficient for most individuals to enhance muscle performance. For bone health, there's about 9 published studies looking at creatine combined with resistance training on bone. And the studies that show an effect on bone, they use a slightly higher dose of creatine than 5 grams. Most of them use a relative dose of 0.1 grams of creatine per kilogram of body weight per day. Or for most people, it's about 6 to 10 grams of creatine, depending on their weight. So if you're 100 kilograms, then you would take 10 grams of creatine based off that relative dosing strategy. And that dose seems to be more effective to enhance bone adaptations than a lower dose, so 5 grams or less of creatine.
Yeah, and this question is more anecdotally of our experience. What have you seen in your training that is a super bad practice or an unnecessary practice with this supplement? What can you see in your training, in the people, in the gym, in the school? It's a bad practice for use creatine?
Yeah, so I think it's for sure creatine is an effective supplement. There's lots of interesting questions that people have, whether you need to cycle on and off creatine, or if you can take it daily, or can you just take creatine on training days, for example. And we've actually, in a recent meta-analysis and systematic review, looked at just taking creatine on training days, and we know that that is an effective strategy, but we don't know if taking it just on training days is just as good as taking it every single day. So we need to do kind of more research looking at all these different questions that people have.
I have one question that I think we did discuss this back in the day when we did our first live stream, Dr. Scott. The thing with creatine and caffeine consumption, because a lot of pre-workouts tend to mix these two, and some others tend not to, because some people say that perhaps there's an interaction. I know you carry out a study on this particular subject, but the answer itself is still not as clear as we would like to, right?
Yeah, correct. So just to kind of be clear, so yeah, we were the only ones to do a training study combining creatine and caffeine. And in theory, there could be this negative interaction. And so we measured strength adaptations, multiple sites. We also did muscle ultrasound, looking at muscle thickness, so muscle size changes at different sites as well. So at one of those outcome variables, so is the quadriceps, we found that creatine increased muscle thickness, so enhanced quadriceps size. But if you took creatine and caffeine, it lessened the effects. So that was one study that was one of the outcome variables. So all the other outcome variables showed no difference between those two groups. And that study was also right at the start of COVID as well. So we had to stop the study. Our labs got shut down. And so it was based off of a relatively small sample size. So people ask me all the time, like, should I combine creatine and caffeine together? And if you do that, it's probably fine to do. If there is a negative effect, it is a very, very small negative effect. And if you're really trying to, win Mr. Olympia in 2025, for example, then I would suggest to take caffeine before you exercise and take creatine after you exercise.
My last question here for you, doctor, it's creatine can enhance the sodium in synergic or not?
Is that sodium bicarbonate?
Yeah. If sodium and creatine have a good synergic in both.
Pero si es bicarbonato de sodio o sodio.
No, sodium.
it's just sodium and dietary sodium, or perhaps if we're taking more sodium, more so in the context, Dr. Forbes, of a peak week in bodybuilding, because
Yeah.
we have some data, right, that can help us with glycogen retention. Do you think it can work in synergy with carbohydrate, creatine, and sodium to get a more full look?
I haven't seen any studies looking at creatine and sodium, but I have seen studies looking at combining creatine and carbohydrates. And yeah, we know that if you take creatine and carbohydrates, it enhances carbohydrate uptake and it also enhances creatine uptake as well. So that's
But it's not.
I think it could be a benefit, but I think what you're asking is like, does it bring more water into the muscle cell and give your muscles kind of a better look? I think over the short term, creatine does bring more water into the muscle, and that's actually one of the mechanisms of how creatine enhances muscle growth. But over the long term, I don't think it's a major kind of mechanism. So there was actually another interesting study that was done out of Brazil and in collaboration with Brad Schoenfeld. He's kind of a muscle hypertrophy expert. And
that's what they say.
Yeah, kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
But what they actually showed was that the ratio of intracellular water to skeletal muscle mass was the same from the start of the study to after 8 weeks of training, suggesting that, yeah, creatine is going to bring water into the muscle, but that's actually going to stimulate the muscle to grow. And that ratio of intracellular water to skeletal muscle mass was the same after 8 weeks of training compared to the start. So everyone talks about, creatine just bringing lots of water into the muscle. And I think over time, it's actually not that important with regards to bringing a lot of water into the muscle.
Thank you very much.
Tocando un poco ahí lo que comentaban respecto a como esta parte de la creatina y su utilidad, por ejemplo, en la Peak Week, creo que es bien interesante el hecho de, por ejemplo, saber lo que podría interferir o no, qué tamaño tiene del efecto, por decirlo así, a la hora como de implementar esto. Por ejemplo, mi pregunta igual era respecto a que al final, si sabemos que la creatina puede retener un poco más de agua dentro de la célula muscular, al tener ya una suplementación constante de creatina, por ejemplo, en un atleta de culturismo, por mantener esa suplementación estable, ¿es lo mejor que se puede hacer o se optaría a lo mejor para obtener tal vez un beneficio mínimo, hacer un aumento de la dosis o tal vez hacer una carga de creatina, o realmente no hay algo de evidencia que pueda respaldar que pueda encontrarse un beneficio extra respecto a eso?
¿Te refieres como a hacer una carga ya cuando se ha consumido o a
Ajá.
separar fase de carga y empezar así con los 5 gramos estándar?
Separar la fase. Sí, separar la fase y empezar con los 5.
Dr. Scott, about creatine loading or the standard dosage, do you think there's perhaps some small effect size benefit for bodybuilders perhaps on loading creatine, or do you think it's not really worth it in that particular context in regards to strength training, to resistance training?
Yeah, so I think over the long term, it has no difference. But for sure, over the short term, if you load, so if you take 20 grams of creatine, usually it's separated into 4 doses throughout the day. We know that you can saturate your muscles relatively quickly in about 5 to 7 days. Whereas if you take a lower dose of creatine, 3 to 5 grams, it might take, up to 28 days to saturate your muscles. So I think if you're a bodybuilder and you're trying to, maximize all your training as quickly as possible and to perhaps even bring a little bit of water into the muscle cell, I think that loading phase could be of benefit. But there hasn't been a lot of studies directly comparing loading phase to no loading phase within the same study. And I think there could be some small benefits to doing that loading phase.
It's kind of a funny one because creatine itself is a supplement that you can take, well, practically for life. So the only time you would do a loading phase is at the beginning. It's like, oh yeah, I did one back in 06. It's 2023 and I haven't done that again. Do you think in some particular moment makes sense to do it again, or just a waste of creatine?
Once your muscles are saturated with creatine, I don't think it matters. I don't think it would matter if you did another loading phase or not, but maybe it would be a benefit to cycle on and off creatine versus taking it every single day. I don't know. I don't know. We need to do that research to maybe you get further benefits if you cycle on and off of it. But to be honest, I don't think it really makes sense to do that, because once your muscles are saturated with creatine, essentially it provides your muscles with just a little bit more energy. And so if you can train harder throughout every day that you're training, then that's going to have bigger impact over time.
Totalmente igual. Ya como último, si se puede, una pregunta más, the last question, respecto a qué cosas podemos considerar, porque por ejemplo ahorita estamos tomando respecto a pues la creatina que se ocupa, los beneficios que tiene la creatina respecto a los estudios, pero ahora sobre todo en la parte de la industria de suplementos, específicamente tal vez un poco más en México, respecto a qué aspectos podemos considerar a la hora pues de adquirir, ¿no? De buscar una buena creatina, de saber que realmente estamos consumiendo monohidrato de creatina, ¿no? ¿Qué aspectos podría dejarle a todos los gym rats que nos están escuchando respecto a qué deben de tener en cuenta para al final saber que realmente están consumiendo pues monohidrato de creatina, ¿no?
This is more of a practical question. Like when we try to look for a creatine supplement, what can we as consumers look out for? How can we know that we're taking the good stuff in regards to creatine monohydrate and all the other forms of creatine? And also on creatine monohydrate, what, in your own particular experience, some key aspects that we as consumers can look out for a supplement, a quality supplement?
Yeah, that's a great question for sure. And most of my world is actually I don't have to deal with that, because we get creatine donated to our lab from the manufacturers, and we also have it independently tested as well. So we know that creatine is pure creatine, and there's nothing else contaminated within it. So that is a risk for sure if you're just buying supplements, that it could be contaminated with other things that you don't want it to be. And so that's something to be aware of. But there's ways to minimize that risk. So one is you can look for supplements that are independently tested. So that's either trusted in sport or informed sport or NSF certified. So I'm not too sure if it's the same in Mexico as it is,
it is
kind of in Canada. Or okay, perfect. So yeah, so look for that. Usually those supplements are a little bit more expensive though, because of that independent testing. So you're going to pay a little bit more money, but then you're more sure that the supplement is what it says it is. So that's what I would recommend. But of course, just get creatine monohydrate powder. So don't be sold on all those other alternative forms of creatine that are actually much more expensive than creatine monohydrate.
Pues, carnales, igual para no usar mucho del tiempo del doctor Forbes, no sé si Dan igual quieras dar como que un pequeño resumen de lo que platicamos ya en estos últimos puntos e igual ir cerrando un poquito el episodio.
Bueno, básicamente puntos clave hasta aquí, llevamos varios muy interesantes. A ver si se me pasa alguno, si no, recuérdenme. El cerebro puede fabricar su propia creatina, una cosa bastante interesante que yo también desconocía. Hay personas que pueden responder más o menos a la creatina independientemente de su dieta, y eso puede ser por cuestiones genéticas, pero no lo sabemos de todo. El momento en que consumimos la creatina no es realmente importante, puede ser antes, durante y después. Lo importante es consumirla todos los días. Ciclar la creatina puede tener sentido en algunos contextos, pero no es necesario. Lo más importante de nuevo es consumirla todos los días. En cuanto a la evidencia emergente respecto a su uso en condiciones clínicas, hay muchas cosas que aún desconocemos, incluye la dosis que preguntabas, Ángel. No sabemos simplemente si necesitamos más, pero parece ser que al menos 5 gramos en la mayoría de personas es un excelente punto de partida, o se puede personalizar un poquito más hacia 0,1 gramos por kilogramo, que por ejemplo para alguien de 70 kilos pues serían 7 gramos, alguien de 88 gramos, etcétera. ¿Y qué buscar en un suplemento de creatina? Pues hay algunos de ellos, por ejemplo está CreaPure, por ejemplo está Informed Choice, que son como de terceros que a ti te aseguran como consumidor que es un producto pues, que es creatina lo que estás consumiendo. Y en México y en varios países se emplean los mismos. Sí puede variar de país a país, pero por ejemplo esa CreaPure, por ejemplo Informed Choice Trusted by Sport, esos también operan acá en México, por si los han visto en algún suplemento. Y no sé si me está yendo a algún punto, pero...
Igual creo que uno que tocaron fue entre si puede haber interferencia, ¿no? Entre el consumo de creatina y
Ah,
cafeína en
claro.
conjunto.
Sí, 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 el doctor doctor Scott estuvo participando en un estudio al respecto y no parece haber una respuesta clara. Si consumes creatina y cafeína juntas, puede que haya una interferencia, pero va a ser mínima, pero no es realmente significativa. Pero ahora que si quieres maximizar las dos cosas, tanto creatina como cafeína, sí hace sentido que la cafeína sea pre-entrenamiento y la creatina puede ser después, y de esa manera, pues ya, te evitas esos problemas. So, Scott, I wanna again, thanks again for your time. I know I just let you know about this podcast yesterday, so thanks for taking the time, and I really do appreciate it. You do a great job taking this information, digesting this information, and presenting it to the public in a really easy way to digest and also to understand. And I think it's really important, at least here in Mexico, from where we're all from, because there's a lot of misinformation. There is a lot of myth busting to be done. So it's really a privilege and an honor to have you here in our podcast. And I really do hope, like I tell you every time we get the chance to speak, to have you here in Mexico one day, hopefully.
Hopefully soon.
Thank you very much for your time, doctor. And it's the first time in GymRats that we try to speak in English, and it's a very fun episode and a difficult episode, but
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Sí. Thanks for your time. I'm really, really honored. Y pues entonces cerramos aquí el episodio. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias a todos, Dani, Fer, Dr. Forbes. Y pues nada, nos estamos viendo hasta la siguiente.
Pero,
Muchísimo.
¿qué te falta, Ángel? ¿Cómo es
Por
posible?
supuesto, por
Oh.
supuesto. Sí, cierto, güey. Sí, cierto, sí, cierto.
Son
Sí,
los
sí.
nervios que te traicionan,
Sí,
¿verdad?
pues
Es
cómo no,
nuestro...
güey, cómo no.
Sí, sí,
Dile,
sí,
Sí,
ya
sí.
llevamos 2 episodios internacionales.
Sí, sí,
Que ya
sí.
uno los
Entonces,
aprende.
Dani, por favor, si puede
Dr.
hacer la
Scott, we
pregunta.
have a small tradition here in our humble podcast, in which you're always welcome to participate in. At the end of our episode, we tend to recommend some musical masterpieces that you like to train to, that you enjoy overall. Do you have any musical recommendations for our fellow gym rats, Dr. Scott?
Oh, I'm a big Beastie Boy fan.
Oh, my man.
Yeah, so I love just the old school rap Beastie Boys.
Do you remember the Sabotage video?
Oh yeah,
That's on top of the cool list.
yeah.
thank you very much, doctor.
Excelente.
Beastie Boys,
Dani,
muchachos.
Dani, Fer, ¿qué tenemos para recomendaciones musicales? Claro que sí. Si gustan, yo comienzo. En esta vez voy a recomendar al gran Luis Miguel, que lo he estado escuchando mucho últimamente. Les dejo la canción pues particularmente todos los álbumes del romance y segundo romance son muy buenos, pero el primero de romances le dejo el de La Gloria Eres Tú. Está muy buena esa rola. Fer, Dani.
Yo, una que se llama Alma Libre de Green Valley.
Pues bueno, para hacer segunda aquí al Dr. Scott, The Beastie Boys, Sabotage, es un gran tema. También está, Give Me Just a Second, because... ahí está. Se me olvida el nombre. Intergalactic. Beastie Boys also, man. Great tunes.
Excelente. Pues bueno,
That very one.
muchísimas gracias a todos, Dr. Forbes. Again, thanks for your time. Y pues bueno, nos estamos viendo en el siguiente episodio. Redes sociales del Dr. Forbes, igual en la descripción, igual que nos escucharon en Spotify, pues vénganse a YouTube, porque YouTube igual tiene la disponibilidad de poner subtítulos para aquellos que los quieran ver con subtítulos. Y pues bueno,